Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. Wow, what a fantastic keynote from Alyssa Knight. Really dynamic and really enjoyed the content that she presented. Good morning. My name is Darren Naftzger. I'm a CISO executive advisor here at Evotech. I'm also the practice lead. This morning, it was really interesting from Alyssa's presentation. She made mention of you can't protect what you don't know you have. And that certainly applies to data as well. And there's been fascinating movement in the data classification and data protection space over the last couple of years. We're going to have a conversation around that today. But first, I want to introduce my colleagues that are going to join us today with this panel, and then we're going to, at the end of the panel discussion, we're going to open up for some Q&A, get some questions from the audience like we did with the keynote. So, but first, Robert, please feel free to introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Robert Yaus. I'm a CISO executive advisor here at Evotech. I have 25 years experience as a practitioner. I've been the head of worldwide information security at Sony Music for a number of years. I've also been the CISO for General Raleigh North American Insurance Company. So I have a lot of practicing experience that I hopefully can add value to anyone's organization.
And secondly, thank you, Robert. And secondly, Jacob Rubin.
Appreciate it. And I'll say I'm in good company here. I, like my cohorts here, CISO executive advisor with Evotech. Somewhere between 15 and 20 years, the math gets a little fuzzy, serving in various leadership roles around the world. Lots of different industries as well, which I think has lent to some of my success here at Evotech. I've done CISO work for manufacturing organizations, hospitality, government, fintech, and on an international stage as well. So everything US, Europe, South America, APAC, all over the place. So hopefully, like Robert, some of that experience bleeds through into today's discussion and provides a good bit of value to everyone.
All right, thank you, Jacob. Well, so going back to what's changed is with regard to data, there's much more organic data creation that's driven by end users, their interactions with very mobile applications, data in the cloud data applications, data is transferred to the cloud, the content being created by end users on the endpoints, your enterprise systems. So very quickly, it becomes very difficult to understand where is all my data, what do I need to protect, how do I need to protect it, how do I get the best use out of the resources that I have available to me to ensure I'm getting the highest return on investment to protect that data. So I guess, Robert, I want to start with you. What are you seeing as some of the primary drivers for enterprises that are starting to consider that, perhaps previously they treated everything uniformly, or that now they're going to look at becoming much more formal in how they approach data classification and protection? Can you share some of your insights on that?
Sure. Well, so on the topic of data classification, I think it's it's something that, number one, let's remove sort of all the technical kind of the business aspects of it. I think, in the very simplistic terms, right, we do classification, every single day. We do it in our homes. We put our prescription medicine, these small little bottles that are childproof protected, and we put it up in the cabinets. And so we classify those as, there's risks associated with that. So it's kind of very natural. Why we don't do this, in the business environment is a very different question. But the principles of labeling, of identifying the types of the data, the same principles carry forward into the business aspect, into information security. And so at a minimum, what we should be doing is looking at what types of sensitivity of data do you have? What data is regulated? What data is really critical to the business? And start classifying in terms of value to the business, sensitivity, criticality, et cetera. And you also have your contractual obligations. And then based off of those, then you can have a more granular set of requirements, right? For example, your prescription medicine has to be in child safe models. And the same way you apply then your controls, your standards, your procedures, your handling guidelines. And really the goal at the end of the day is to be able to focus on the things that matter within your organization more than the things that don't matter so much. So you can really get and manage risks to an acceptable level.
That's great, Robert. So I want to go back to your time at Sony and Generali, which I know both companies had a significant global reach. What were some of the things that you found as far as how geography impacted data classification, data protection considerations? What were some of the things that you've seen, and how was it approached?
Well, so geographically, when you look at the landscape, your regulations, your laws, they all differ. So even within the United States, you have different privacy requirements. So California, Utah, Colorado, Virginia, Connecticut, they all have privacy laws into effect. There's a couple more where legislation is in the process. But then even outside of the US, you look at the privacy laws, there's 154 countries which have privacy regulations either already enacted or in the legislative process for becoming effective soon. And so you have a whole set of various different requirements, not only in the privacy, but also depending on your industry, whether you are a financial institution, whether you are in healthcare, whether you are a supplier for Department of Defense, your requirements all differ. And that's why it's so important to accurately classify the data and to really understand the rules around data protection around them. And so when you do have, go through, an incident, an event, or, just even, from your regulatory, from your audit perspectives, having a very clear understanding of the types of data that you have, all of the rules and what controls, moving from left to right, having a very, very good, crisp, laid out understanding of the data types and the rules is very critical, I think.
I think you raised a really good point there. With the digitally enabled companies, they very easily can traverse geographic boundaries very quickly and suddenly have, for example, I know of a small company that really they really expanded very quickly with some very good product offerings, and were suddenly had a global presence in a matter of a few quarters. And suddenly they had the regulatory and compliance burden for the types of data that they were using of a large multinational. So there's really, as soon as you traverse into new geographies, more than likely, I think the number there would be roughly 80% of countries have some form of data privacy law that needs to be considered to ensure that you need to consider to ensure that as you enter those new markets, you're not running afoul of what local regulation. So, Jacob, your time in the CISO chair with the North American Consumer Company, what were some of the things you took away with regard to your regulatory obligations and how you dealt with them?
Robert's talking about 154 sovereign countries, and then getting into naming states, and then this, even on top of this, you've got general consumer goodwill and reputation to consider. I'm just getting an anxiety attack thinking about this. And it's interesting. There's a lot of, I think, smaller companies that, from an investments perspective, think I'll go to compliance first and security second, particularly in the context of digital companies. And the internet, as everybody knows, is a global thing. It's not bound to one country or bound to even regions, and stepping into the internet can very quickly inject you into any number of those countries that have regulatory obligations. So the days of even small companies building to compliance first and using that as a stepping stone is really becoming, it's always been a calculated risk. It's just getting riskier and riskier as you go. And regulatory matters have always been a 4-letter word for me: CCPA, CPRA. There's a lot of 4 and 3-letter words in there. And living in a state here in Colorado that has recently enacted our own privacy legislation that goes into effect next year. It's much more front of stage for me as a practitioner. And there's a lot of companies that I do business with here locally that I think are going to be caught off guard despite a time to cure. But another interesting aspect of this is as more and more states in the U.S. adopt privacy legislation, the Fed is going to get more and more interested in adopting their own standard for this. I think there's a few reports published recently that said that tipping number is around 18 to 20 states. You get to that point, and the pressure on the Fed to actually step in and standardize something, taking the burden off of states' rights and publishing something at the federal level becomes more and more likely. But as it comes to consumer privacy, it's always going to be complex, even if there's a U.S. federal standard that's likely to mirror GDPR. It's going to have its own nuances, and going just for compliance these days is way too complex and one-off. Again, 154 countries, and maybe you don't hit all of those countries, but even a small business that's digital based could easily combat 30 to 40 of those. And trying to get that to be crosswalked and identify your overlaps and then get your outliers. Again, building to compliance these days is going to be very difficult. Instead, basing your programs on sound practices, industry best practice, some of the international frameworks, whether it's ISO or NIST or something else, those are really your best bet when it comes to even getting close to regulatory compliance these days. And one last thing on this I'll say is, 100%, data privacy and regulatory compliance is not 100%. It's not a binary thing. You're measuring risk here, right? It's a spectrum that I think practitioners need to remember and understand. So when you're out there knocking on your executive team's door for more funding to combat some of these regulatory troubles that you're looking at, you need to start with the 80%, knock out a huge chunk of that risk that comes with even stepping onto a global stage, and just reduce your likelihood of interaction with attorneys general. And I think you're going to be heading in the right direction.
Yeah, I think it was great from Alyssa's presentation,
Yeah.
her distinction between compliance and security. That certainly applies in this realm as well. So, Robert, we've established that we need to do something. So, as a company, sitting in the CISO chair, how do you get started with this and make inroads within your organization?
I did your job.
Yes.
Well, the starting point, I think, is looking at it more programmatic. Data governance itself is very fundamental, and it touches a lot of different areas within the business. So a programmatic approach is going to be your best bet on setting yourself up for success. So the fundamentals are going to be, based on your company industry. Again, whether you're in healthcare or in financial, you're going to have different requirements, but based on your industry, so your company profile, your contractual, regulatory, legal requirements, start developing that data classification scheme and start thinking about the data handling guidelines. So what are all the rule sets around the different types of data? That's really your first step. And the second step, then again, tying this back to the program, is you want to have defined roles and responsibilities of that program. So you need to answer some really, really fundamental questions. As an example, who are your data owners? So we know IT is the data custodian, but who in the business owns the data? Who is responsible for data classification? Who is authorized to classify data? Who's responsible for maintaining data inventories? So there's a whole set of roles and responsibilities that need to be defined at the program level. Otherwise, it's just going to be a lot of confusion. Things are not going to get done, and you can't hold anyone accountable.
I was just going to add, I think that what a great point there is, the CISO shouldn't go it alone, right? Legal and privacy need to be at the table with you to drive a successful program within your organization. I think you had another comment.
Yeah, and then, essentially then, you start building your system inventories, your data inventories. You look at your data flows. There's a whole bunch of activities that then flow into actually getting a really good view into your data inventory to then begin data classifications and everything that then falls to the right of the program. But again, my recommendation here is it starts at the top and it's a program. It doesn't have a finish, and there's a lot of involvement from different sides of the business. So having clearly defined roles and responsibilities and accountabilities is critical.
Yeah, thanks. So Jacob, one interesting thing that Robert brought up was data types. And I know that, organizationally, effectively, there's all sorts of data classification, different types of data, PHI, PII, PCI. But really, fundamentally, you have structured data and unstructured data. What's some of the nuance and considerations that a security program is going to have to address both unique types?
So structured versus unstructured data. I mean, think of left brain, right brain almost. You've got structured data is this ideally predictable thing that you can easily get as lost in unstructured data as you can in structured data, and generally structured data. You have to have an understanding of how your business operates, what those data are used for, how they're structured, where they go, the data flows. There's just as many nuances in structured data as there are in unstructured data, and particularly in recognizing effective means to inventory and categorize your structured data is very critical. Understanding how the business is going to turn around and use that. Leave it to our good friends in marketing and sales to find new and innovative ways to expose our business to risk. You need to be closely partnered with those folks that, when it comes to growing the business, are most likely to leverage structured data. It's customer data sets for identifiable information. It's purchase histories and other identifiable type things that are leveraged to grow your business. And there are significant value to the business in those things. It's not that having those data is necessarily poor practice or anything. In fact, you can do monumentous things with a generous data lake. But you're playing with this lever of risk versus reward that comes out of that, and making sure that your business can transparently understand what those risks and rewards are is critical. And those same partnerships will return back to you an understanding of the data, how it's used, and absent those understandings, it's the same with asset inventories and really any other asset that you're trying to protect. Lack of understanding of what it is, how it's used, those manner of things really handicaps you in being able to protect those things. The bear with unstructured data is maybe it's not as scriptable and it's not as used as en masse, but the problem is it's this fluid thing. I mean, if structured data is a solid block of wood, your unstructured data is slime almost. It's not quite water, but it's really difficult to keep that in a ball and keep some of it from leaking out and going different places. And even understanding what one piece of data is today might morph into something else later, because by design, it's supposed to change, being unstructured data. And that's everything from your users' emails to file stores to data output from reports and things that are occurring on a live basis, operational metrics and things of that nature. And the ability to work with these data gets to be much more difficult. There was a comment during Alyssa's presentation around ChatGPT, which always brings up AI, and boy, even the understanding of that term these days is really starting to get fluid as well. But in the absence of something that works much faster than we do at a human level, you've got your work cut out for you in unstructured data, and you end up taking these huge swaths. All email is treated as one thing, and all OneDrive, SharePoint type data are treated as another. And that's not necessarily bad either, but it's less optimal, right? It's a little more gray in the middle. So leveraging things like automation technologies, indexing, other types of AI to discover what's in those data is going to be far more beneficial to you on the unstructured side than the structured side. And really, I think is the only way that you're going to get an effective program these days is to get something that's out there 24/7, crawling data, inventorying things, and has a language interface that you can use that's intelligent enough to understand what you're asking for, what you're looking for. And you pair that capability then with threat hunting and some of the other governance type work that you might be doing as an operations team to determine where are my biggest risks, what type of threats am I solving for. And you always have that ball of slime data that's out there. But really, if you're looking at this from a perspective of who is after what are my active threats, you're going to knock out a bunch more risk that way, coming at it from that angle, using those AI capabilities or those language interpreters to determine this is the threat, how are my data at risk to that threat, and then solving those specific items.
I think that's a great point. Being able to have whatever solution you adopt, being able to move at the speed that data is actually being created in that organic manner within your organization. Well, now I'm going to ask Robert a very hard question, which is, what about all the data that you own that's outside of your organization that sits in your supply chain? How is a security program supposed to realistically ensure that potentially up to thousands of suppliers, they have good line of sight into what data is what of the company's data is where, and how it's being managed and protected, and is it aligned with how it would be managed and protected internally?
I'm so glad this is Robert's question.
Well, so those are the realities, right, that we live in. We no longer are in control of the data, and we just have to sort of accept that, we have SaaS vendors, we have supply chain, we have, quite frankly, as you said, hundreds, often thousands of companies who handle the data on our behalf simply because they're more efficient. But we don't have control and visibility. So I think this is where security can really take the opportunity and become an enabler for the business, recognizing this is the model, and creating frameworks that simply allow, the supply chain to change, vendors to be onboarded much more quickly by having a process that's shifted to the left, where security is by design, privacy is by design, involving security, following those frameworks for ensuring, again, very simple things. What data what's the data? Who should have access to that? What are the controls that are required? Being able to set those efficiently up front is going to allow, again, the acceleration for third parties to be involved within the business in a secure manner. So, the best thing is to partner. Number one is every CISO needs to really understand the business. What it is, what type of data is necessary? How does it flow from left to right? What's the data life cycle look like? What's critical? What's sensitive? And really defining your program around those parameters and those boundaries. So, if you're coming in, and this is a new program that you're kicking off, and if you need to know, where all your data is, the best approach that I can recommend is, you're gonna have to shake the tree and figure out, where your data points are, see what falls from that tree. So you can look at existing contractual agreements, maybe even have a contract management system, pull out your agreements, see what's in those agreements. A lot of times there's data processing agreements. You can also look at your web gateways, look at, websites that are being hit by your clients, determining, your SaaS vendors that way. You can even go as far as parsing logs. Look at financial reporting, anything that the company buys that has remote, even, SaaS, software services, hosted services on there. Those are great ways to then identify data where it is.
That's
And,
great.
just to add in here, Darren, I'll say, when it comes to your vendor community, Robert called out a lot of great ways to recognize where your data are flowing, who has your data, and even to a degree, the types of data they have. And there's contract references, there's regulatory obligations. I don't know about you, I don't have all day, despite I think a function and even a requirement in some regulatory environments to audit my critical vendors and ensure they're handling data the right way. Stuff happens out in the operating world, and there's training gaps, and even the most well-intentioned vendors and supply chain partners can mishandle those data. So right along with understanding where your data are going, how they're being handled, what they're being used for, where they're being stored, the controls, the environments, all of this, it's important equally, I think just like with any other type of security incident, not only have an understanding of what your operating model is, but have the ability to respond and to reduce the risk to your business through offsetting things like risk transference through insurance, isolation of types of data that get sent, so they only get the most critical things and not the whole basket. Einstein, smart guy, ounce of prevention, pound of cure. If you don't need to send your vendor that entire database or give them, full writ access to a database, don't. Give them select columns, give them something that's smaller, that a mishap by one vendor may not pop the entire balloon, sink the entire ship. And again, the ability in general to respond when these types of things happen. Very few people remember all the companies that get breached. Everybody remembers all the companies that get breached and handle it poorly, Target, Home Depot, et cetera. So it's how you respond to these things. It's the transparency that comes with these. Be equally ready to respond to data leaks and issues around your data as you are to try to control your data on the front end.
That's a great point. I guess I'll add one last point to that. All of your leverage as a company or as a security program is before that contract gets executed.
Yeah.
So ensure if you're starting to look at pushing data out into your supply chain, that what you want to see from a security perspective is results in really well thought out contractual obligations.
Get involved early.
Before it gets executed, because after that,
legal.
live or die by those contract obligations.
Absolutely.
So really important. So Jacob, I want to go back to unstructured data. I know this past year you've done a lot of work looking in that product space, and as I said at the top of the discussion, there's been a lot of change in this product space in the last 24 to 36 months.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could give us some highlights on what's occurred, how it's how those products have really enabled starting to identify, classify, and protect unstructured data, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. So maybe there's two schools of thought here, particularly around unstructured data and these kind of partners that can help you with this. Medium and enterprise class businesses. Talos has some really good capabilities in this space. Their model of identify, protect, control is a well thought out model. It's based in everything we've been talking about here. Discover your assets first and understand where everything needs to be at, both structured and unstructured. But since you asked specifically about unstructured, they play well in this space. Interviewing your massive user communities and things of that nature to understand how your business works, to identify. And then from the protect space, they've a series of technologies with varying capabilities for structured and unstructured data to control that, to label that. And it's not an accident. The last of their phases is control, and relates a little bit to data loss prevention. But it's an accessible technology that I think user communities can adopt well. And really spanning the spectrum. You mentioned the last 24 to 36 months. I'm going to kind of catch on this in my throat a little bit, but Microsoft, had you asked me 5 years ago, even, who are the major players in the security space, let alone the data security space, I don't know that Microsoft would have made the list. They maybe made a different list, but in the last few years, 3-4 years, over $1 billion invested by Microsoft in the data security space. A lot of acquisitions, M&A, that I think, in my opinion, from a product perspective, I don't get much more visibility than that behind Microsoft's doors. But from a product perspective, have been well integrated into their standing M365 platforms. And they're approachable from small to medium to enterprise class businesses, and their licensing model is, can be tailored, and it's an as you need it type approach. And I think that gives them a pretty big leg up in this space, is they've got, as confusing as it can be from time to time, they really have a pay for what you need type model between a per user count rather than these kind of mass enterprise all or nothing type deals, a per user count licensing to multiple tiers, E1, E3, E5, just the privacy stuff, just the governance stuff. You know, they really add multiple dimensions to their licensing model. So, you know, the licensing is extensible enough for it to be approachable for just about any type of business. They've got environments that are built for mom and pop shops up to skiffs and Stig and, you know, everything else that in between. So, you know, plenty of extensibility there. And then just in their general product development, you know, again, through acquisitions and then internal development for their investment dollars, the work that they have done in AIP, MIP, the terms get, you know, muffled up as their marketing team gets a hold of them. But the core technology that's there around Microsoft's data governance capabilities is solid, especially for those that want to splurge a bit for the E5, or maybe not a full E5 suite. Maybe you're E3 and you want to buy a couple of E5 SKUs, select SKUs. The automation capabilities that we were talking about earlier with AI recognitions and unstructured data are quite impressive. It saves a ton of time for administrators and operators. And really, a lot of companies are using this kind of single ecosystem approach, where a lot of their day-to-day unstructured data is in email and is in OneDrive. And if it's not in OneDrive, it's in the big players. It's in Dropbox, it's in Box, it's in, you know, pick your favorite data storage company. Microsoft's got a great APK, you know, SDK type approach there that allow you to extend their capabilities into some of their partners. Adobe, there's something close to 1,000 partners now that they connect to. So, you know, again, I thought I would, you know, never hear myself saying this because Microsoft, in my opinion, can focus on too many things from time to time. But in the data space, they've done a good job here. And even forward looking into their product roadmap, you know, we spent a lot of time earlier talking about regulatory obligations, and privacy is the biggest regulation, you know, that's evolving these days. And you almost need a third party to help you understand what your obligations are. I mean, there's people hiring law firms to just understand what their regulatory obligations are. You know, and the lawyers get involved, things slow down, things get complex. You never get straight answers of, well, what are my obligations? Well, it depends. You know, Microsoft's got a new product line called Purview out that's designed to help you manage your regulatory obligations, and it integrates into the rest of their platforms for security controls and things like this. But the big piece that it touches on is around data governance and how you're handling that and where your data are flowing. So it's a nice suite of products. Again, Talos, medium to enterprise class businesses. Microsoft really runs the gamut. You know, there's a reason they're the top player in a lot of spaces, and it's their investment in that space. But, you know, again, specific on the unstructured data, you need a product line that's got the automation capabilities in there, the indexing, the spider crawling, those types of things. And then if all of that is done and you don't have a good language interpreter that's sitting in the middle between your now data lake of data, your meta lake, that's sitting between your meta lake and an operator, it's going to be very difficult. You will either need to highly train your operators to work with a custom data set, which creates its own staffing issues down the road, or it's just wasted time. So making sure you have not only good AI, but a good language interpreter in the middle is going to be critical for unstructured data.
Right. Well, so unstructured data really, you know, when you start tightening the vice on how that flows through your organization, who can do what with it, there is that's quite impactful for your user community. And so Robert, as a security executive, what are some good guardrails to you know, introduce that to your organization and begin to realize the value of some of these products that Jacob just mentioned?
Yeah, I like that you said guardrails, because it's very easy for things to go off the rails.
Off the rails.
So I think, look, number one is, you know, and I kind of said this before, you need to know the business. So you need to know how your business handles and uses data on a daily basis, what systems they interact with, et cetera. That's really, I think, foundational to looking into where you put your controls and how you put those controls. But, really what I think is essential here is looking at policy definitions that are really enforceable. So things, you don't want to go in with something that's too aggressive, that's just not realistic. The output is either going to be that you are going to be stopping the business from functioning and from working because your rule sets are too aggressive, or you're going to just get inundated with alerts and you don't know what to do with them, and then it just becomes completely useless because you don't know what to focus on. And so, tying this back to your statutory regulatory obligations, your general counsel is going to tell you what those are and how to define those, within the organization, so that that companies can be compliant with requirements. And then when setting the policies internally, pay attention to what can be measured, how are you going to monitor it, and ultimately how are you going to enforce those policies.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask one more question, and then we're gonna go to open it up for questions from the broader summit. So Robert, last question. Now you've done a great job. You've got this all implemented and it's running in the background. How do you keep this maintained, keep the momentum behind it, so that over 24, 36 months, all that work, that concerted work that you put into getting to this point doesn't begin to deprecate, and then suddenly 3 years hence you're right back to where you were when you started the effort?
Under threat of violence, Robert?
So look, ultimately, I think, if you make it easier to do the right thing than the wrong thing, you're ultimately going to drive better outcomes. And the same is true for, your data protection, your data governance. If you make it easier to do the right thing, you're going to naturally advance. Ultimately, though, you're going to have to put some trust into the business, into the end user, to appropriately identify, classify the data and how to handle the data. Trust, I would say trust, but also verify. So you need to have, ongoing monitoring, and the change that you want to drive forward is start changing the culture, start thinking about a culture of more compliance, a culture of accountability, and everyone has a stake in this. It only works if everyone is swimming in the same direction. So, it's a cultural shift, and it takes time, but there's little tidbits and enforcements that can be done, whether it's on your training, use practical examples, use examples within the business. And then when you see things that are not going as intended, or that are sort of wrong behaviors, correct them immediately. Don't let those float up. Use those all as lessons learned.
Okay. Hey, thank you, Robert. Jacob, thank you. So let's go ahead and open it up to the broader team. Really like to hear the questions from the audience.
So Lanny had a question earlier around how does the fact that data is mostly generated at the edge, not in the center, so to speak, in a traditional network, affect governance and classification? It has a pretty big effect in the technological ability to identify, protect, control, to use the Talus model, but even just to govern the data in general. As the market itself moves more toward, we ebb and flow out of this endpoint mainframe type model, and as we're currently on an endpoint wave moving back into a mainframe wave, where everything is stored centrally and the endpoints are less and less important. Data are generated on the endpoints. What I think is a little bit different this time around is the level of connectivity and control that exists on endpoints. You'll never be perfect in this space. There will always be data that are generated outside of your control system. There's nothing stopping me, even in the most controlled environments back in the federal data center days, of hopping on grandma's computer and dumping the intellectual property that's in my brain into an unregulated environment. But those are your extremes. The points Robert was just making around the easiest path and user training and adoptability, those are things that are not to be forgotten here. But also relying on some of the tech these days that is where these controls are now following the data and not necessarily stuck in just your core traditional environment. You know, you've got rights management technology out there and things of that nature where protective controls and authentication obligations and authorization obligations can be set on a file by file, data by data basis. So for particularly unstructured data, boy, we should have just called this the unstructured data panel. Emails, files, you name it. There are more opportunities today to address and assign controls to those manner of data, regardless of where they go, because just about everything's got to be connected to the internet these days. It's not impossible to, no controls impossible to get around. I see all the hackers in the comments section yelling at me, telling me that a Word document's, DRM protections can easily be overcome. Those are the extremes, right? Those are advanced persistent threats, those manner of things. But for the vast majority of data that are going to be developed at the edge, Laney, you've got a lot of technical controls these days. And, again, brushing on Robert's point, the user communities, there's a whole very boring doctoral dissertation out there by some uninformed writer that talks about the impact that users have on programs and why they make the decisions that they make. And it really comes down to neutralization and self-justification, that I knew better than the security team, or I knew better than the corporate policy, or my circumstance was unique. So getting your user communities to understand the core principles of your business and what you're trying to protect and why is going to be the easiest approach to even handle 15% of the 20% of fringe cases that you're going to get on data that's developed outside of your direct controls, right? And ensure that those data are handled in an appropriate manner.
So I really like that question from Laney. What's interesting is if you're a knowledge-based organization, most of your most valuable data, your thought leadership, your intellectual property is being created out on the edge, not in the center.
Yeah.
So capturing, collecting, collating, making sure that you've got that adequately protected, especially for knowledge-based organizations, is number one, it's a real challenge, but even has a higher degree of importance to those types of organizations. So I'm going to just, Matt Schutfeld raised a point about a stewardship model with key vendors. I want to circle around on that, because there's later today, there's going to be a conversation around third-party risk management and some of the things that you can do in that space, and really triaging those vendors and developing that stewardship model with those vendors is critically important. So I think I'm looking forward to the conversation this afternoon on third-party risk. And we'll delve a little bit more into stewardship and how to triage third parties. But in closing, I just really want to thank everyone for attending our panel. Robert or Jacob, any final thoughts before we close?
No, I think just good discussions, good questions. My final thought here is you're building a data management program is to, instead of serving as just a CISO, put on that CRO, that chief risk officer hat. Not all companies need to be addressing data management, data regulation right now. Before you even start adopting a data management program, ask yourself if your company is ready for this from a risk perspective, or are there other risks that you need to be adopting that are more critical. Robert made a great point earlier about a tone at the top and getting executive endorsement in these things, and to ensure that they're successful. It's equally important to understand that risk does not exist just in the security space. So take a look around your business, ensure that this is, the item to be addressed now, and that in and of itself will give you a much greater probability of success when implementing a data management program. Is it the right time? Are my risk tolerances there? Do I, am I a widget company or am I an intellectual property company? And what you do for a living as a company can vary quite significantly on the depth and capability of program that you need to implement to be a viable value provider for your organization.
And Robert, in closing.
Yeah, it's a journey, right? It's you got to start somewhere. Think of it as maturing. You're not gonna flip the switch and be good at it. So it's set yourself realistic goals in terms of advancing the program, maturing the program. Every step forward is a step in the right direction, and good programs on data security, data governance, require years of concerted efforts to get to a state where it really, the value shows off. So you're in for the long game in this journey.
Well, so I want to thank you both for, sharing your knowledge, some of your insights on some of the things that you've done both in prior lives and since you've been here with Evotech, also bearing some scars. There were some knowing laughs in there while we went through that, which was great. So for those attendees in the broader summit, I hope you enjoy the rest of today's content. It was great to spend time with you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.